At 19, my parents believed a stranger's lies. They threw me out and celebrated while I walked away with only a bag. I was 17 and counting down weeks to winter break when everything turned sideways. Our place in Milwaukee never felt warm, but it wasn't a battlefield either. Dad James ran the house like a shift supervisor who never clocked out. Mom Grace floated between nerves and chores, collecting secrets like coupons in her apron. Mason kept his headphones on, and his opinions filed away for emergencies only. Harper was bright and loud until Jackson arrived and turned down her volume. Jackson swaggered in like a guest who mistook our home for his stage. He learned our rhythms fast and started inventing new ones without asking permission. He called my dad by his name and squeezed my shoulder like we were boys. He wore my hoodie without checking, saying it draped better on his frame anyway. At first I treated him like whether you ignore until the windows rattle. Then the garage lock appeared, shiny and smug, where nothing had ever latched before. That garage held my old console, a busted laptop, and boxes of clothes. Dad said he was locking it to keep raccoons away, which sounded ridiculous. Mom started flipping her phone face down whenever I walked into a room. She acted casual, but her hands trembled like spoons in a spinning drawer. I kept telling myself the weirdness would pass if I gave it space. Instead, the house leaned away from me, like a picture hung crooked. I stopped lingering in the kitchen and learned the sound of conspiratorial whispers. Jackson began rearranging drawers, labeling shelves, and correcting how he folded towels. He told Harper real families make hard decisions and then hold their nerve. I pretended not to hear and hid my better headphones under a mattress corner. Late in September 2011, I stayed out with friends walking the riverfront. We ate greasy fries from a truck and argued about playoff seats. When the wind rose, I zipped my jacket and started the long walk. The porch light at home was blazing like a lighthouse decided to retire. My key slid into the deadbolt and stopped like it found a bone. I jiggled it, muttered, and jiggled again, because doors obey history sometimes. 10 minutes later, the knob turned from inside like a verdict being issued. Dad stood there, solid and silent, blocking the gap with his shoulders. He didn't say hello, just stared like I tracked mud across heaven. I stepped past him and smelled coffee, perfume, and new plastic from packages. The living room looked staged, lamps on, seats chosen, eyes placed for angles. Grace hovered by the kitchen doorway, blotting her face with a paper towel. Mason leaned on the wall pretending to read notifications while reading my body. Harper sat bald on the couch, while Jackson guarded the hallway with ceremony. He had my gray hoodie draped across his arm like a captured flag. I tried to step toward my room, and he shifted to block the hall. He smiled like a host instructing a guest to admire the hors d'oeuvres. Grace started talking about missing food, and missing bills, and missing steady feelings. Dad chimed in about tools gone from the garage, wrappers found near paint. I said none of that was mine, and the wrappers weren't even recent. They kept stacking claims until the room felt like a courtroom without exits. Harper whispered she was scared because I slammed doors and forgot simple courtesies lately. I stared because the last fight was about a charger and nothing else. Jackson cleared his throat and said he saw me lifting cash from Grace's purse. He added he watched me sneak a box out through the garage. I laughed because the garage was locked and because I'd been downtown tonight. They talked over my laugh like a choir rehearsing through a fire alarm. Dad said I never helped, never tried, and always left messes for others. He said Jackson was the only one stepping up and paying real bills. Jackson adjusted my hoodie, like he needed the stage business for credibility points. I asked Mason to speak, and he stared at the carpet like television. He said I stirred drama and acted surprised when storms showed up afterward. I tried to move again, and Jackson pressed a palm to my shoulder. I brushed him off, and Dad grabbed my forearm like a rope on deck. His grip bit down, and something sick clicked in my chest like tin. I yanked free, and Grace stepped in front of the hallway like a gate. I said I just wanted my phone, my notebook, and my jacket tonight. Dad said all my things were in the garage, and I could take them. He said I could also take myself wherever boys who misbehave choose sleeping arrangements. I asked where exactly he expected me to go at 1 in the morning. Grace said she didn't know, but she knew the house had to feel safe. I walked to the garage and saw my life stuffed into 3 soft boxes. The lock hung open now, which told me timing mattered more than truth. My sneakers, books, and the laptop were stacked like sale items without price tags. Jackson followed and stood in the doorway like a referee hired by one team. He told me to be careful, then smirked when I bumped the doorframe hard. I told him to move, and he leaned in close enough to count mints. He said grown men talk, children shove, then blame everyone else for consequences. I pushed past him, and he clamped my arm with a practiced little twist. I swung a bag loose, and he hopped back, calling me unstable and dangerous. Grace came rushing out with tears that didn't smear, which told their own story. She said leave now, or they would call someone who could make me leave. Dad stood behind her with his arms folded like a crossbeam over emptiness. I walked down the driveway carrying boxes that pinched my fingers into numb silence. Mason stood by the curb pretending to scroll, but checking my face constantly. I asked him what this was, and he shrugged like a rented extra. He said I should have expected consequences given the way I've been lately. I asked for help, and he said he wouldn't pick sides in family messes. The front door closed with that heavy thud old houses make when siding shifts. Halfway down the block, my phone buzzed and flashed the family thread again. Mason had posted a picture of cake in the kitchen. Everyone gathered. Jackson sat in my chair with his arm around Harper and no apology. Dad raised a glass. Grace smiled red-eyed. The caption said we found peace. I left the thread and kept walking until the wind unlaced my collar slowly. Anger warmed me better than the jacket would have if I'd worn it. I wasn't crying. I was cataloging, because memory becomes leverage once organized properly. At the corner, I stopped beneath a flickering streetlight and counted my pockets. I had a cracked phone, $40, and a bus card with 2 rides. The laugh that rose in my throat felt old and unfamiliar and electric. Some boys begged to be let back in. I learned to count doors. I carried the boxes to a bench and rested while trucks yawned past. I thought about how easily stories grow legs when the tellers rehearse together. If they wanted me written out, they should have spelled my name correctly. A siren rose somewhere distant, and I remembered the word dangerous in Grace's mouth. It tasted like metal, like batteries pressed against a tooth, like trusting the wrong map. I stared at a dark window and pictured Jackson folding my shirts tomorrow morning. I pictured him sitting at my desk pretending it had always belonged to him. I pictured Dad nodding while Jackson explained how the lock saved everyone's sanity. I pictured Grace pouring coffee and telling Harper that peace sometimes demands sacrifices. I pictured Mason tuning a playlist and deciding silence keeps families from exploding. I didn't promise revenge, because big promises snap when winter gets inside your coat. I promised attention, which cuts deeper, slower, and always finds the right artery. Cops came with their lights low and their hands resting close to routine places. Dad pointed at me on the sidewalk and said I wasn't his anymore. Grace told them she feared for safety and future and every fragile thing nearby. I didn't fight except to keep my tongue from naming everything backwards. They cuffed me gently, which only made the whole scene feel colder somehow. Neighbors peeked from curtains the way fish watch ripples and hope currents settle. In the back seat, I watched our porch lamp bleach the yard to chalk. I wanted to sleep and woke up in a room painted hospital beige. The paperwork said temporary placement while things could be evaluated by responsible adults. The calendar swallowed 8 months like a trick, and my name shrank on forms. When I finally stepped out, spring air bid, and then forgave my lungs. The first message waiting was a reminder to stay clear of home entirely. No apology followed, only silence shaped like furniture I used to move around. I saved the photo of cake and the caption for nights when resolve thinned. If they thought the story ended there, they underestimated a boy who catalogs. I walked toward the bus stop and held the railing like a steering wheel. The city smelled like thawing tires and fryer oil and second chances mislabeled. I wasn't going back to knock. I was going forward to listen carefully. Every sound the house made without me would teach me where to place pressure. I tightened my backpack straps and let the brake hiss time my breathing. Nobody said my name at that stop, so I repeated it for myself. Ethan still fit, even if the house tried to tailor me into suspect. I kept walking west until the sidewalks stopped cracking and my feet stopped shaking. By the time clouds opened, I already knew which doors open under patience. The story didn't start with the handcuffs. It started with the shiny lock. I would learn which keys were mine and which locks were only theater. When that lesson finished, I promised myself the house would hear my footsteps. Not on their carpet, but in the walls, where plans settle and breathe. I was 17 that night, but I felt decades older by sunrise. The city pressed on, and I matched its pace until my anger cooled. Cooling didn't mean forgetting. It meant tempering steel before anyone else recognized the blade. Some families choose saints. Mine chose a villain because villains carry useful blame. Fine, I thought. Then carry this with both hands when I send it back. 6 years sanded the edges off my anger, but they never dulled the point. By 2017, I had a tiny studio off Glendale, a metal gate that screamed when it moved, and a mattress that remembered the shape of my back better than anyone in my phone. Work meant unloading boxes at a warehouse that smelled like warm plastic and brake dust, then sweeping a floor until the broom bristles looked like seaweed dragged across rocks. I didn't post much, and when I did, it was usually a photo of noodles or a joke that only I laughed at after midnight with headphones turned low enough to hear my neighbors argue. News about home never arrived directly. It seeped through cracks like damp that stains the paint and refuses to dry. A guy from up the block mentioned my name while buying cigarettes, then flinched when I turned my head like he'd been caught pocketing a candy bar in front of a mirror. He said folks heard I'd fallen apart and started taking whatever wasn't nailed down, which meant my family had practiced the story long enough to perform it in casual conversation. I swallowed the reply I wanted to make and wrote it down later, because ink holds grudges better than throats do when winter wind gets involved. The first sharp hit landed as a letter with my name spelled correctly and my address almost right, which means they had to ask someone who actually knew me. It was a past due slip from a carrier that was supposed to be closed the week I left, complete with fees that breed like fruit flies in a kitchen you only pretend to clean. I called, waded through flutes of hold music, and learned the family plan limped along under my authorization because nobody bothered cutting the cord that strangled my credit slowly. The woman on the line clicked her keyboard like a tap dancer and promised closure, then gently suggested a fraud alert because someone had added a new line to the account in June. I started keeping a ledger in a cheap black notebook, the kind kids use for chemistry formulas and secret poems they won't admit are theirs. On one page, I listed every account that could possibly be tracing back to my signature or my social, then drew arrows where payments should have been, but weren't. On another page, I wrote the car note details from memory, because some debts etch themselves into bone even when you think you've stopped staring at the numbers. The car lived across town now, plastered with a bumper sticker about hustle and discipline, driven by the man who once told me adults talk while children shove. Jackson and I crossed paths at a grocery store on a Tuesday evening when fluorescent lights made everyone look like they were carved from the same tired stone. He stood in line holding energy drinks and a rotisserie chicken, phone on speaker, while Harper murmured about rent over the background noise of a television and someone laughing too loud. He turned when he felt me watch him, tried to smile through his surprise, and told the air that real men handle responsibility while looking straight at my face. I could see a corner of paperwork peeking from his pocket, a printout that carried my name next to the car's last 4 digits and a balance that didn't belong to his voice. I didn't start a scene, because scenes feed men who rehearse righteousness in bathroom mirrors before they leave the house. I waited until he paid, then walked out behind him far enough to be boring to anyone who might ask later about proximity or intention. He loaded the chicken into the back seat of my former Future and drove off with a squeal that sounded like a violin played by someone who hates music. I wrote the date down next to a note that said, "When they miss again, call lender and request formal notice copy," because paper speaks when memories are coached to lie. Harper reappeared online in a burst of curated sunlight with captions about gratitude and the magic of new beginnings that happen after boundaries and prayer. In one post, Jackson used my old laptop like it had recognized him at birth, screen tilted at that angle people choose when they want the camera to flatten their lives into approval. Grace posted a countertop full of labeled containers with a caption about decluttering, and I recognized my mug shoved behind a ceramic jar like a witness relocated without paperwork. James shook hands with men at the community center and smiled like a man whose roof never leaks and whose grass never browns along the edges where sprinklers miss. The second sharp hit arrived as a rumor with a badge, because Jackson filed a complaint that I was hanging around the block and making people nervous with my questions. A patrol car coasted behind me near the bus stop one night, lights off, windows down just enough to feel like a test of how my spine handles old voices. The officer asked where I was headed and whether I had business near my old street, which told me someone had practiced saying my name again with the word trouble attached like a magnet. I answered calmly, showed him a schedule from the warehouse, and mentioned a conversation with a lender about a shared note that needed untangling for everyone's benefit. He nodded like men nod when they know paperwork can outrank a story told too many times at a table where no one ever contradicts the host. Before he left, he said a neighbor claimed I'd been seen near a side gate last week around 9, which was hilarious because 9 was the exact hour I clocked in. I showed him the punch log on my phone, watched the suspicion shrink into boredom, and waved while the cruiser rolled away like a stagehand pulling scenery across a tired set. Bias doesn't vanish just because you hold a receipt under its nose. but it does blink when the ink sits dark enough to leave smudges on fingers that turn pages. Work introduced me to a night clerk named Luis who liked crosswords and security cameras more than customer service, which made him the right kind of friend for my problem. He recognized Jackson from the kind of memory that absorbs faces because numbers bore it, then pulled a clip where Jackson stashed a metal lockbox into a trunk 3 nights before everything unraveled years ago. The timestamp sat like a stubborn stain next to a date I remember for other reasons, and I copied the file to a cheap thumb drive that warmed my palm like a pulse. I didn't rush to wave it around, because trophies weigh more when you haul them uphill toward the right room with the right listener and the right pen. A sharper moment arrived when I checked my mailbox and found a padded envelope with no return address and tape that looked like it had been recycled twice. Inside sat 2 pawn slips with Jackson's scrawl bent into a version of my name that would fool exactly no one with eyes, and a reading habit that survived high school. One slip matched the serial of Dad's missing drill, and the other matched the laptop I'd once babysat through 3 operating systems because saving purchases beats buying new when your pockets cough dust. Someone wanted me to have proof without asking for a thank you, which meant someone in that house either grew a conscience or finally got tired of hearing the same clumsy lie. Mason texted twice that month with messages that read like a man apologizing without using any words that could be printed and attached to consequences later. He asked if I had posted anything unwise, then followed with a question about whether my current address was secure, which framed him as concerned while preserving his plausible distance. I replied with a picture of a notebook page that showed my ledgers, redacted like a spy novel that knows exactly which paragraph matters to the judge. He read it, typed something, stopped typing, then sent a sticker of a shrug that landed like a door closing softly in an empty corridor. Grace finally broke the silence with a status about forgiveness that named no one, but described a son who wandered into darkness and needed prayers to find the porch again. The comments filled with people who love a tidy story about prodigals returning without discussing who sold the map to begin with. I screenshotted everything because screenshots retain their shape when memories decide to recast villains as volunteers and volunteers as thieves with complicated feelings. I wasn't hunting sympathy, but I was collecting context, because context is the bodyguard truth hires when the room keeps getting crowded with extras who demand lines. One night a rock popped my window screen and landed on the rug with a generous helping of alley dust, and a rubber band knotted around a note. The paper read, "Let it go before someone gets hurt," in handwriting that tried to look adult and settled somewhere between teenage threat and church parking lot complaint. The slant was familiar, but not from the household. It belonged to a cousin who once laughed at my jokes while stealing fries off my plate like a tax. I folded the note gently, slid it beneath the thumb drive in the drawer, and added a line to the ledger that said, "Fear means heat, and heat means something finally started boiling." Bills tightened around the old address like a bad scarf after an icy sprint, because public portals reveal more than people realize when they forget to uncheck boxes. Late property tax notices sat in plain view for anyone who knew which drop-down menu to select and which parcel number corresponds to the sagging porch and the dead hydrangeas. I printed the page, not because paper is necessary, but because paper has weight that screens only imitate when you tilt them and pretend words can be stacked. A neighbor who likes gossip more than gardening mentioned an HOA letter crumpled in the recycling, complaining about cars parked wrong in grass that had developed philosophical objections to photosynthesis. I tried knocking once, not because I thought a conversation would heal anything, but because a signature sometimes requires a face to remember where shame keeps its handwriting. Jackson answered with his chin already raised, and I saw my headphones hanging around his neck like a trophy you win for pretending another person's life fits your head perfectly. He leaned into the doorframe and called me unpredictable, which always means you predicted the wrong person's next move, and now you're scrambling to rename the feeling creeping up your back. Grace told me through the crack that I could have a box of my notebooks if I promised to stop stirring stories, which is what people call truth when narratives start shedding fur. I left with a folder and a plan that sounded simple when whispered under freeway noise, but complicated quickly when written out in full daylight with prices attached. I shut down streaming services that billed to my pocket while playing in their living room, and the silence must have made that kitchen feel like a tomb with good lighting. I contacted the lender about the car and asked for instructions written like recipes for people who burn water, then followed each step like a dance taught by a patient aunt. Every missed payment generated letters that couldn't be ignored without leaving footprints, And I learned the schedule the way hunters learn which trail mud keeps secrets and which puddles reflect truths. People stopped liking Grace's posts, which is the algorithm's way of scheduling an intervention without bothering to invite a therapist or the person who actually got hurt. James began to look haggard in photos, jaw clenched, eyes searching the edge of the frame for a solution that didn't require admitting the first decision was rotten from the start. Harper's captions lost their glitter and drifted toward quotes about endurance that sound noble until you notice their slogans for staying in rooms that keep shrinking. Mason attended a barbecue without tagging anyone, which told me he was learning stealth in a family that had always preferred spotlights to lamps. The car vanished from the curb 2 streets over at dawn on a Thursday, metal clanking against metal like a bell rung for a church that forgot the hymn. Jackson posted a furious story about haters and saboteurs, then deleted it before lunch, which made the absence more visible than the words ever were while they flashed on screens. I saved the blank space where the story had been, and I slept that night with the window cracked to hear what the city says when victory finally breathes. This wasn't revenge, not yet. It was leverage introduced to the system that had pretended I didn't have hands. When the landlord asked why I wanted a second deadbolt, I told him neighbors kept mistaking my door for theirs, which was true if you count relatives who forget which names belong on which mailboxes. He installed it while telling me about his brother, who once let a whole family sleep on his floor and lost every spoon he owned by the following afternoon. I paid the extra fee and tipped him cash, then practiced turning both locks smoothly, because future doors deserve hands that don't hesitate when it's time to protect the room. By the end of that month, my ledger had more check marks than questions, and the weight of proof began to shift from my shoulders to the table where signatures eventually meet pens. I could feel the house across town developing a tremor that started in the garage and moved inward like a bruise darkening under old paint. You don't need microphones to hear a structure complain when support posts rot, and someone keeps insisting the sound means a neighbor's radio is too loud again. Their silence reached me like cold air through a misaligned window, and I knew they were finally listening for footsteps they pretended were never coming back up the walk. I didn't hurry them, because pressure works better when the clock teaches the lesson for you, one overdue notice at a time, until even the proud start checking the mailbox twice a day. By the time spring rolled around, I thought the chaos had finally burned itself out, but I should have known better. Trouble in my family had a way of finding me even when I didn't go looking for it. It started one Tuesday afternoon when I got a voicemail from my cousin Noah, who's not the type to leave messages unless something's seriously wrong. His voice was low, urgent, the kind of tone that makes your chest tighten before you even know what's happened. He said there was movement on the situation with Liam and Ava, and that I needed to hear it before the rest of the family started spinning their own versions. I called him back while walking home from work, the heat of the pavement still radiating through my sneakers. Noah didn't waste time. He said he'd overheard a conversation between Ava and some event planner in a coffee shop downtown. Apparently, despite everything, they were trying to salvage the wedding. Only this time, they were aiming to pull it off in the States. The new plan, according to Noah, was to slash the guest list to a fraction of the original and find a smaller but still luxury venue somewhere on the coast. I could hear the disbelief in his voice when he said Ava was still insisting on an NDA for every attendee. The absurdity hit me like a brick. After the venue collapse, unpaid vendors, and public humiliation, they were still trying to act like royalty. I asked Noah why they wouldn't just cut their losses and move on, but he said Ava kept using the phrase brand integrity like she was defending a corporate logo. It wasn't about marriage anymore. It was about the spectacle. She wanted to prove she could still pull off something grand, even if the guest list now looked like a skeleton crew. 2 days later, my phone blew up again, this time with a group chat notification from Emma. She'd gotten wind of the new plans and had somehow gotten hold of the updated invitation. It was a PDF so overdesigned it looked like an advertisement for a luxury timeshare. The exclusive package was now $48,000 per person for a weekend in Monterey, with private yacht access and curated dining experiences. Flights, of course, were not included. I nearly laughed myself into traffic. It was the same scam, just wearing a cheaper suit. The family reaction was swift. Uncle Rick sent a voice memo saying he wouldn't pay $48,000 to watch anyone say vows, not even himself. Grandma, bless her, asked if Monterey was in Italy. And then Dad chimed in, saying he'd rather spend that money getting a used pickup and a new roof. The rebellion was instant. People weren't falling for the discount version of the grift. But Ava didn't take the pushback quietly. That night, she sent a mass text to the remaining invitees, accusing the negative voices in the family of sabotaging her happiness and Liam's legacy. She claimed the wedding wasn't about money. It was about celebrating a rare love story that deserved a rare level of commitment from the people around them. I read the message twice, wondering if she'd rehearsed it in a mirror. Then the unexpected happened. Mom called me. She said Liam had been at their house earlier, pacing in the backyard while Ava sat inside scrolling on her phone. He told them he was under pressure to make this wedding work at all costs, because Ava was convinced that if they pulled it off, all the public embarrassment would vanish. Mom said she'd never seen him look so worn down, not even during his worst work stress. That hit me harder than I expected. I was still furious about the way he'd treated everyone, but I couldn't ignore the fact that he looked trapped. A few days later, the first real crack appeared in their new plan. The yacht company they were counting on for the Monterey weekend pulled out again, this time citing reputational concerns. Translation: they didn't want their brand tied to another Ava and Liam disaster. Without the yacht, half the luxury weekend lost its shine. Emma called me laughing so hard she had to catch her breath, but I couldn't shake the thought that Liam had probably just watched another piece of his fiancée's dream crumble in front of him. Things spiraled quickly from there. The boutique hotel they'd been negotiating with suddenly became unavailable, which we later learned was code for refused to hold dates without a deposit. Ava tried to spin it online, posting vague captions about choosing the right energy and trusting the universe, but the truth was obvious to anyone who knew the pattern. They were running out of places willing to do business with them. Then came the late-night call from Noah. He said a mutual friend had spotted Liam alone at a bar near the marina, nursing a drink and staring out the window like a man watching his own escape route drift further away. I asked if Ava was with him. Noah just laughed. She's at some influencer event in LA, posting selfies about resilience, he said. That was when I realized they were already living separate lives under the same roof. By the end of that week, the Monterey plan was dead. The final nail came in the form of an email from Ava herself, sent to the entire family. She said that due to unforeseen logistical conflicts, the wedding would be postponed indefinitely. She blamed unsupportive elements for making it impossible to create the magical environment she envisioned. It was the closest she'd come to admitting defeat, but she still managed to paint herself as the victim. Emma forwarded me the email with a single line: "Guess who's about to implode?" And sure enough, Ava's Instagram story that night was a carousel of wine glasses, cryptic quotes about betrayal, and a song about taking back your power. Liam, on the other hand, went silent. No posts, no calls, nothing. Until 3 weeks later, when he showed up at my apartment looking 10 pounds lighter and carrying a single duffel bag. He didn't even wait for me to invite him in before saying, "It's over." I didn't ask if he meant the wedding or the relationship, because by the way he dropped onto my couch and stared at the ceiling, I knew it was both. That was the moment it finally clicked. This wasn't just a family feud anymore. This was the collapse of something he'd been clinging to for far too long, and the relief on his face told me he'd finally stopped pretending it was worth saving. And for the first time since the whole mess started, I felt like maybe, just maybe, the real work of fixing things could begin. Liam didn't speak much that first night, and I didn't press him for details he wasn't ready to give. He sat on the edge of my couch with his hands locked together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His shoulders curved forward like the weight of the last few months had bent him into that shape. I made coffee because it felt like the only thing I could do without making the air heavier. When I handed him the mug, he looked at it like he wasn't sure if he deserved something warm in his hands. He said Ava had left 3 days earlier, taking 2 suitcases, her ring, and the only set of car keys. There was no screaming fight, no dramatic confrontation, just a single sheet of paper on the counter with a list of mutual expenses and a line at the bottom that read, "You'll figure it out." He admitted he hadn't told anyone yet, not even his closest friends, because a part of him was still waiting for her to walk back through the door with some story about how she needed space but wanted to try again. I asked him why he came to me instead of going to his parents, and his answer came fast, like he'd already thought about it 100 times. He said they wouldn't understand, that they'd only remind him how much they'd sacrificed to support Ava's plans, and how much it had cost them socially to stand by him when everyone else called it a scam. He said he knew they'd turn the whole conversation into another lecture about loyalty, and he just couldn't stomach it. Over the next few days, I started to see just how deep the damage went. Liam barely touched his phone, except to scroll through old messages from Ava that he never replied to. His bank account was in the low triple digits, and his credit cards were maxed out from covering deposits Ava had sworn she'd reimburse. Worse, the car she'd taken was still in his name, and she'd already missed one insurance payment. It was like watching someone slowly wake up in a burning room, realizing piece by piece that every escape route had already been blocked. On the fourth morning, I found him sitting at my kitchen table with a folder I recognized immediately, the same one that held the paperwork for the old car loan I'd been fighting over for years. Except this time, it wasn't just my name tied to the debt. There were new pages showing co-signed accounts, late fees, and a trail of charges to luxury rental services I'd never even heard of. Liam said Ava had convinced him to temporarily put her on some of his accounts so she could help manage the finances while planning the wedding. She'd drained them in under 6 months. That was the moment my sympathy started turning into something sharper. I'd been on the receiving end of this kind of calculated sabotage before, and I knew exactly how quickly people like Ava could vanish once they'd wrung every drop of use out of you. Liam was still clinging to the idea that maybe she'd just gotten overwhelmed, but I'd already seen the pattern too many times. This wasn't an accident. It was extraction. I told him if he stayed here, we were going to fix this the way it should have been handled from the start, methodically, without emotion clouding every decision. That meant freezing every joint account, pulling his name from anything she could use, and contacting every creditor before she had a chance to dig the hole any deeper. At first, he hesitated, worried it would look bad if she decided to come back. I reminded him that the only thing that would look worse was a bankruptcy notice with his name in bold at the top. The call started that afternoon. Liam sat across from me, speakerphone on, while I walked him through exactly what to say to each bank, insurance company, and service provider. Some of them were cooperative, some tried to give him the runaround. But the important thing was that the tide was starting to turn. Every confirmation number we wrote down felt like another door slamming shut behind Ava. But the real turning point came a week later, when one of Liam's friends sent him a screenshot from Ava's public account. She was in Miami, draped over the hood of a rented sports car, holding a champagne bottle with a caption about celebrating freedom. The hashtags were about success, independence, and living your best life. I watched Liam's face change as he stared at the picture. First confusion, then realization, and finally, a kind of quiet rage I hadn't seen in him before. He didn't throw anything or start shouting. Instead, he stood up, walked to the kitchen, and asked if I still had the ledger I'd been keeping for my own situation. When I handed it to him, he flipped to a blank page and started writing, slowly, carefully, each item Ava had taken or tied him to. It was the first time in months I'd seen him take control of something instead of just reacting to it. Within days, he was making moves I didn't even have to suggest, closing her access to his accounts, reporting the car as in default, and cutting off every luxury service she'd been charging to his name. The fallout was almost immediate. She called him screaming when her hotel reservation in Miami got canceled, then left a string of texts accusing him of publicly humiliating her. He didn't reply to a single one. By the end of the month, Liam had untangled most of his finances, though the damage to his credit would take years to repair. More importantly, he'd stopped looking over his shoulder every time his phone buzzed. There was still a heaviness in him, but it was no longer the kind that pinned him in place. And then, just when it seemed like we were both finally breathing again, the universe decided to throw one more twist into the mess. Late one Friday night, there was a knock at my door, not the impatient pounding of someone looking for a fight, but a slow, deliberate rhythm that made the hair on my arms stand up. I opened it to find Ava herself, standing in the hallway with a suitcase at her feet and a look that wasn't desperation so much as calculation. She said she just wanted to talk, but I could already see in her eyes that she hadn't come to apologize. She'd come because she'd run out of options, and because, in her mind, there was still something left to take. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ava stood there smiling like she'd rehearsed, her suitcase wheels still warm from the street. Liam froze behind me, but I didn't move, keeping my hand on the frame like a guard on a drawbridge. She spoke about misunderstandings and fresh starts, her voice sweet enough to rot teeth, but her eyes kept drifting to the apartment behind me like she was counting what might be worth keeping. I told her the conversation was already over, and she laughed like she thought I was bluffing. When Liam finally stepped forward, his voice didn't shake. He told her the locks had changed, the accounts were closed, and the only thing she'd be leaving with tonight was her suitcase. She stared for a moment too long, then pulled her phone like she'd call someone, but walked away instead, heels striking the hall like a clock ticking down. I knew she'd try again, but now we'd be ready.